Hello, everyone. Welcome to Air Dialogue's panel discussion event. Tonight's topic is inclusion in the workplace. I'd like to give a massive thank you and welcome to our speakers and also to you, our audience. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Our speakers will also be answering questions later, so you can send your questions down below also. So a bit about Air Dialogue. Air Dialogue was established in 2010. Our sister charities Dialogue Society. We have the aim of advancing social cohesion by connecting communities, empowering people, and connecting people by engaging and in developing ideas through dialogue. In the last few years, diversity and inclusion has been a popular topic among businesses. This diversity and inclusion requires focus, expertise, and care to succeed. Conversation is critical, and advancing true inclusion and quality for all workers will not be possible without actively listening to people from different backgrounds and communities. Without that, it will be difficult for companies to move beyond the superficial. So I'm going to give the stage to our speakers. First, I'd like to give the stage to Shannon, who is a researcher in social inclusion and equality.
Hi, good evening. As Elizabeth said, my name is Shannon Enright, and I work at the Economic and Social Research Institute. My main research areas are social inclusion and equality, migration, and integration. And I'm so glad to be part of the panel today with Sandra and Pedro and to get to hear a bit about what they've been doing in this area. So, because of the type of work that I do, I will be speaking about inclusive workplaces and diversity from a research standpoint. The work that I'm generally involved in with my colleagues is mostly bigger picture and nationally representative, but doesn't always capture the really lived experience of people in the workforce. So, when we talk about diversity, it's often spoken about, we talk about inclusive workplaces. But in order to have an inclusive workplace, we need to have employees from a diverse range of backgrounds who represent the population in which they work. Recent research conducted by myself and my colleagues on integration and non Irish nationals show that there are actually occupational differences between Irish and non Irish nationals in the type of work that they are employed in Ireland. So there are serious differences. So Irish nationals are more likely to work in public admin, health and social care and education sectors, and non-Irish nationals are more likely to work in accommodation and food and admin and support sectors. And when we have these kinds of differences, it kind of leads to a bit of inequality. So differences on the type of work groups do has implications on a number of facets of their lives. For example, we can't ignore the impact of this on finances during COVID, where some sectors have completely closed down due to restrictions. So, people working in accommodation and food sectors have been particularly hard hit. And as I mentioned, non Irish nationals are more likely to work in this sector. But when we think about discrimination in accessing work or being employed, we know from research in Ireland that ethnic minorities are reporting higher rates of discrimination in the workplace. Previous research that was conducted by my colleagues at the ESRI on ethnicity and nationality in the Irish labour market looked at subjective experiences of discrimination in both seeking work and in the workplace. So, respondents were asked in the past 2 years, have you experienced discrimination in the workplace or when you were going for work, so looking for a job? And they found substantial ethnic differences in experiences of discrimination, with Black Irish 5 times more likely to state that they had experienced discrimination seeking work and twice as likely to experience discrimination in the workplace than white Irish respondents. And this was even after controlling for other factors that you think would affect this, like age, education, gender, the region that they're living in, and the length of time they've been in Ireland. But no differences were found in discrimination rates after accounting for these factors between white UK, Western European, Eastern European, Asian Irish, Asian non Irish, and white Irish after controlling for the factors that I just mentioned. So we know that diversity and inclusivity is not just beneficial for employees and for their mental and physical well-being, but it's also beneficial for the companies. We know that companies with more diverse workforces have been found to be more profitable. There is also less turnover there, as employees who generally feel respected and valued for their contributions are more likely to stay in their jobs than going to companies who are not inclusive. And people have tried to address increasing diversity in a number of ways. So there are a lot of current measures, one of which would be mandatory diversity training. However, many of these initiatives are failing to increase diversity. Research conducted in the US into why this might be found that compulsory measures such as diversity training can sometimes actually lead to backlash among employees and managers and lead to decreased diversity among workers. But it's not all bad. There are definitely things you can do to improve this. I'm not all doom and gloom. Involving managers and employees in addressing diversity issues led to better results, with the research showing that voluntary measures such as targeted college recruitment, mentoring programs, self-managed teams, and task forces all increase diversity in businesses, which, as I mentioned, is great both for the people that are working there and also for the company themselves. So it's really a win-win situation when we increase diversity and build more inclusive workforces. No one actually loses out. This is all really positive. So, in short, to sum up, inclusive work cultures are representative of the population. They are also respectful of people's differences, and they tailor positions to people's strengths. And above all else, they are fair and they allow for equal access to jobs, to promotions. And when all this is done, it means that there's less occupational segregation in Ireland, which is only a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. We hear about these issues, but it's nice to hear from some actual research and hear from some factual data. Next, I'd like to give the stage to Sandra, who is the head of diversity and inclusion at DCU.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to yourself and the team for inviting me to speak this evening. I can say I'm actually no longer head of equality, diversity and inclusion at DCU, so I stepped away from that role in December. I had two roles when I was in DCU. One is the director of the Centre of Excellence for Diversity and Inclusion, and that's what I'm going to focus on our work there this evening. And I'm delighted to say that I have Pedro, who has worked with us for the last couple of years within the centre, recently moved to Twitter. We're still mourning his move, can I say? But it's great to have him here this evening just to talk about some of the work that we're doing on the ground. So what I'm going to do is just take a couple of minutes just to give you a sense around the work that we do within DCU, and talk to you a little bit about the Centre of Excellence and the work we do there. And then bring you into the project that we've been working on for probably the last 18 months now around race equality in the workplace. And I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion with the panel after, so I hope you have some great questions coming our way. So I have a few things I'm going to read. Normally I just talk, but if I started talking, I'd probably be still talking 20 minutes later, right? So I have a little bit of a script to stick to this evening. So forgive me if it sounds like I'm reading. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background on DCU. So our mission in DCU is to transform lives and societies. And we're very committed to that. And we do this through the people and the quality of the experience of education that we provide to our students. And also to the environment that we create, the working environment that we create for our staff. In December 2016, DCU became Ireland's first university sanctuary. There's probably not a lot of people know that. Thankfully, I have to say, many of the universities around Ireland now have taken on that certification around the university sanctuary. And essentially what that means is it's providing safe environments and support for asylum seekers and people in direct provision to be able to continue their education and be supported in their education in Ireland. And it's great to see DCU year on year, we increase the number of scholarships we have under that program. And I think UL actually are doing very well, and Maynooth as well. So really worthy program to consider, particularly if you're in the workplace. I would say, do a little bit of research around that. The University of Sanctuary, it's a fantastic program. Myself, I joined DCU in 2016. I spent 20 years in the telecoms industry before I came into DCU. And my connection to the university is I studied organizational psychology within DCU. I'm very passionate about diversity and inclusion. I've been involved in it for probably about 14 years. And it was mainly on a voluntary basis before I came into DCU. And when I came into the university, what I was doing was using the academic experts within the university to deliver on the strategy for us as an employer. And what we realized is we had a lot of organizations coming to us looking for support around diversity and inclusion. So what we did is we established the Centre of Excellence for Diversity and Inclusion. And essentially we describe it as taking the research off the shelf. So we work with organizations. We have founding partners such as PwC, AIB, Pfizer, FMR, Leia Healthcare, and others. Hopefully we don't have any of them on the phone on tonight that I have forgotten there, because I have forgotten some. But essentially what we do is we work with employers on all different aspects of diversity and inclusion. And essentially what we do is bring the academic research and the theory into practice and into the workplace. And what we do is with every organization we work with, whatever we produce, whether it's toolkits or research or training, we make sure that it's available to everybody. So that's really what it's about, is taking the academic research into best practice in the workplace. So earlier, it's actually not earlier this year now, it was last year when George Floyd was murdered in the US. It seems to have created a shift in people's consciousness, and in Ireland, which is fantastic that has happened in Ireland as well. I was actually talking to an academic from Arizona State University today, and we check in every so often, and she's saying to me, I hope, it's still on the agenda, it's still a focus in Ireland, and it absolutely is. And I think it was something that needed to happen. And I think right across the globe, we're feeling this, but we need to keep that momentum going. But what had happened for us in the Centre of Excellence, I had a lot of employers coming to me looking for support around, how do we respond to this? What do we do? We have, this has, deeply and profoundly affected some of our employees, and we don't know, how do we respond to this? And I suppose the first thing from my perspective is I thought, well, why are you coming asking the white person to talk to you about this, right? Because it's not my lived experience, and I certainly shouldn't be the person that has a voice or is front and center of this. But at the same time, I also had people coming to me, connecting with me and sharing their personal stories with me as well of how difficult it is and how much racism actually exists in workplaces in Ireland today. So Pedro and I decided we had to do something about this. So we had employers looking for support, which was fantastic, right? So we're pushing an open door. And at the same time, then we had people who were, wanted to tell their lived experience and wanted to be part of the change. So what we've done, so there's a few different things that we've done within the Centre of Excellence, and I would encourage you to go onto the Centre of Excellence website and have a look at some of the resources we've developed there. And we've resources, can I just say, on every aspect of diversity and inclusion, but in particular, we've created the Race Equality Hub. Now, Pedro is going to go into more detail around how we've kind of formalized and established this working group. And what I'm going to do is just kind of talk to you about how we've kind of brought things together within the Centre of Excellence. So the first thing we've done is created a Race Equality Hub. So that's a section that's specifically focused on helping people kind of learn about race equality, learn about racism, and build their capacity and understanding in this area. For example, we've published a white paper around how can we engage white Irish people, what's the story of Ireland? We're quite young from a multicultural perspective. So that creates a wonderful opportunity, for Ireland to get it right and to learn from some of the mistakes of other countries. And the white paper really is a starting point about that, around telling that story and that history of how we've got to today. We have created and developed a toolkit with Bank of Ireland around removing bias in hiring. I'm not going to go into too much detail around that because I know Pedro will tell you the details of that. And we have 2 organisations aligned to pilot a coaching and sponsorship around the translation of skills and CVs, you know, so again, removing some of those barriers and access in, to get into the workplace. And finally, we've established a race equality council. And again, that's made up of those people who confidentially shared their personal experience with us that has really influenced all the work we do around race equality in the centre. Again, I know Pedro will talk to you a little bit more around that. So if I think about the insights that what we have gained, you know, one of the key things that people said to us is that within their organizations, diversity is generally focused on gender, and there isn't a focus on race. And one of the comments that was made, and I think Pedro will agree with this, you know, that one of the comments that was made is that race is the elephant in the room, you know, so it's the one aspect of diversity and inclusion that people just, you know, don't talk about, it's avoided. And we wanted to do something about that. We wanted to change that. And one of the things that I realized is that, you know, quite often people are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to get it wrong. You know, is it okay to call somebody a Black person? You know, is it okay to use the term person of color? Is it, you know, what happens if you can't pronounce somebody's name? You know, so it's about having that conversation and creating a space for people to be respectful in asking these type of questions. But we had to create a space, and that's really what the work we're doing in the centre is, creating that space, keeping it on the agenda so that organisations are not avoiding having the conversation. One of the other insights that we found out was that people were changing their names so that they could get through the hiring process, you know, the first round of that sifting of CVs. Like, that's, you know, disgraceful that that's the kind of thing that has to happen. So that's really what our part of the work we've done is to try and address some of that challenges and work with employers to remove that, whether it be conscious or unconscious bias, and try and create that equitable access to the workplace and make sure that everybody has equal opportunity. For me, just to say, you know, I felt deeply uncomfortable as a white person being asked to represent underrepresented voices, right? So, and what we've done within the centre is create space for me to move out of the way so that other people have an opportunity to tell their story. But at the same time, on my own personal journey, what I've realised is that it is really important for me to speak up and be anti-racist and be actively anti-racist and to be an ally, because there's power in me telling the story as a white person and me being on that journey. And I think I take that very seriously. And I would encourage everybody, no matter who you are, you know, that's how we eradicate it, right? Is we isolate the racist. And there's only one way to isolate the racist, and that's you do not allow it to happen in your company. So whether it's your family or a joke or, you know, it doesn't matter what it is, you do not allow racism to exist in your company. And that's a personal thing. That's a personal commitment. And that is the only way we can be anti-racist. It's not enough to just go, I'm not a racist. So, and I'm sharing that because that's the journey that I've been learning and the journey that I've been on. And the power of allyship, I think, is really, really important. And can I just say, just to tell you a story, and very briefly, and I know she won't mind me sharing this with you. I was a part of a launch of a panel for a financial institution there recently, and there was at the end of the launch, it was the Multicultural Network. One of the, she's a woman of African descent, shared her personal story. So she said she was on the bus on the way into work one morning, and she said she was racially abused on the bus. And she said it was an absolutely terrible experience. And she said, you know what? She said, I don't blame the ignorant person who racially abused me. She said, I blame all the people who sat around to make that and allowed that to happen. She said, because while they sat there and allowed that to happen, they sided with him. They aligned with him, you know, instead of aligning with me. And for me, that's something that's really stuck with me. And that's how, you know, it's this, we need to deconstruct this racism system in our heads that we have been born into, where, you know, where people are divided for the color of their skin. And just to say that the team and I, and Pedro has been on this journey. There's about 5 of us, I think, within the university, maybe more, have been working with Dr. Eben Joseph and her Black Studies and anti-racism training. And I have to say, it's been absolutely phenomenal and enlightening for us. And it's helping us with that deconstruction and dismantling of this racism and racist system that we were born into, because you can't see it. When you're in it, you can't see it, you know. So it is that unlearning, if that makes sense. So yeah, so I suppose I'm looking at my notes there, and I'm going to say it again, right? It's not enough to just not be racist. We need to be anti-racist, right? And that's every one of us individually. So when I now work with Dr. Eben Joseph, she was looking at her research. Some of you may be familiar with it. If you're not, definitely absolutely worth getting her book and bringing it in to the workplace. So her PhD dissertation looked at racial stratification in the Irish labour market. And some of you may be familiar with these stats. I think, Shannon, very similar to some of the research you've quoted, where she talked about the respondents reporting experiencing recurring discrimination on an average of 4 to 4.6 times a year. 1 in 3 of all respondents who looked for a job reported experiencing discrimination, with every second respondent mentioned skin color or physical appearance as the reason they feel they were discriminated against. And 1 in 3 people believing that the reason was their first or last name, and 1 in 5 thought it was their accent. Like, that's just, it's unacceptable. So that's part of the work we're doing around that. There's no excuses, you know. So when the toolkit's about to be launched, there's no excuse anymore when employers have access to that information around, and essentially what the toolkit's about is how do you remove the conscious and unconscious bias in the hiring process. I don't know how much time I have left. I suppose there was one thing I wanted to leave you with, and just a couple of key points. Myself and Tom Clonan, some of you may not be familiar with Tom Clonan. He describes himself as the first whistleblower ever in Ireland. So Tom was a captain in the army, and he did a PhD, this is 20 years ago, in the Defence Forces. And what he wanted to, his PhD was focused on the experience of women in the Defence Forces. And what he discovered is that it was a very hostile environment for women. So he published his research, and he had to deal with the consequences, obviously, unfortunately, after that. But anyway, long story short, myself and Tom were invited back to go and present to the army while they accepted his PhD 20 years later. And I wrote, I was asked to talk about diversity and inclusion and why it's important. And I just have a few lines, and I just want to read it to you about what I had presented on the day. Okay, so and again, this is my beliefs of how things need to be here in Ireland. It is well documented that during the past 2 decades, Ireland has become increasingly diverse and has earned the right to be described as a multicultural society. With over 18% of people from migrant descent, Ireland is a beautiful and rich mixture of backgrounds, faiths, skin tones, languages, and accents. However, this is not evident due to the lack of representation and visibility at many levels in our society. Inherently, migrants bring additional values, perspectives, and enterprise. But in order to actively participate in Irish society, we need visibility in all spheres of Irish life. We have an opportunity to create a culture and a society where all people feel they are welcome, they can participate, and they belong. These needs are central to the human experience, and people from migrant backgrounds are a permanent feature in Irish society, and they want to participate. And those in positions of privilege and power can remove the barriers for minorities by designing targeted, effective interventions that support participation and integration. Removing these barriers will lead to a stronger, more diverse, and ultimately more reflective society. So that's the ethos, that's where we're coming from. And it starts with every individual person and every step and everything we do. And we need to keep this on the agenda in our organizations, in our conversations with people. And I've started to see this slowly. We have now Levy leading in the public appointment service with a real focus on diversity within the public appointment service. In higher education now, we have mandatory reporting around race and ethnicity, so data collection on an annual basis to try and change the sector. We have the Department of Justice and Equality now doing a review of the 10 years later of the action plan to find out what it is that needs to be done there. And then I'm part of the Citizens Assembly with Dr. Catherine Day, and all the way through we have ensured that the representative voices are there from every part of Ireland and presenting that to the citizens. I hope I haven't gone over my time. I would just one final word, right? When I get asked all the time is what's my advice, right? I always say the one thing, and it's the one thing that drives my world, is do not step over it. Do not step over it and leave the problem behind for somebody else to fix. Okay, so that's the only piece of advice I'll give you. Be part of the change. There's plenty of people that we all think the same. We need to create that critical mass and drive the change and keep race equality on the agenda in your organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sandra, and thank you for what you're doing. I think it's so important that we're doing research in these social issues, but to take it a step further and turn that into action. And you talked about the deconstruction and the unlearning. I think that's so important. Thank you so much. Finally, let's hear from Pedro, who was a former leader at diversity and inclusion at DC.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much, Sandra, for the introduction. So I am so excited to meet you all in this conversation. So just a little bit about myself. I am originally from Venezuela. I think I can't hide my Spanish accent. And my background is a psychologist and working in change management. And I believe this is my connection to the center, because the way I see diversity and inclusion is basically like a transformation, a cultural transformation. If we really want to be successful when we transform our culture, we need to be very inclusive. I mean, if you want to be successful, you have to connect that diversity and inclusion to the culture of your company. That is the best way to do it. So going back to Sandra's point, we worked together, we created really good resources. I really encourage you all to have a look at the website, and you will find amazing resources of different topics of diversity and inclusion. But going back to race equality, so we created the Race Advisory Council. But just to give you a little bit more context of that, so after the death of George Floyd, we started to be in contact with a lot of companies, and they said how you can help us to start the conversations. As Sandra mentioned, this is new for us. We are still learning. But basically what we did was we created the Race Equality Forum. And then what we wanted to do is to gather information from different people, from different nationalities, country, ethnicity, skin color. And what we did was to understand what was the problem that we wanted to solve. So we identified like 8 barriers to promote race equality in the workplace. And then based on that, we created the toolkit. So I would like to explain to you a little bit of all the barriers that we have found. So the number one is, as Sandra mentioned, is basically diversity and inclusion is mainly focused on gender and LGBTQI+, but there is not the same conversation taking place in terms of race equality. The other finding was that definitely race equality is the elephant in the room. So nobody wants to talk about that, and people are avoiding that kind of conversation. And even here in Ireland, for example, the term BIM is not well known. This is basically well known in the UK, but you know, it's very important to be familiar if you want to start the conversation with all the terminology. The other point is that definitely there are people changing their names in order to get interviews. So that was very shocking for me when I heard that. I was like, oh my God, can you tell me more? So there is a methodology to do that. And apparently the name has to be connected to your emotion. It is like a long process to do that, but that was very shocking for me. And once people changed their name, they started to get interviews, phone calls, email from employers, etc. The other point is that basically during the hiring processes, when people, for example, they the accent is not like a native accent. People try to avoid, or hiring managers try to avoid, to call that person. And there is a lot of misinformation about the different types of visa. So for example, if someone see my name, which is very Spanish, Pedro, maybe a lot of hiring managers are trying to avoid to contact that person because they don't understand if that person has the right visa, or maybe if the English is not right, etc. The other point is a problem related to qualifications. So if my qualification is not from Ireland, it is really difficult to understand. And in our research, we found out that there is an organization here in Ireland that can help employers to match. If, for example, if someone have a certificate from Asia, from South America, you can connect that certificate to Ireland, and you can identify where is the connection. The other is a lack of opportunities to network with people. And the other point was very, very important, which is the majority of the people, they mentioned that their voices are not being heard. So I do recommend, and I think my recommendation is, if you are you are a manager, or you have like a senior position in your company, to create spaces where people have the opportunity to mention or to identify their barriers, their problems. I think that is very key, to understand what is the problem that we want to solve. The other point is isolation. So a lot of people mention that because I am different, because I don't look like the others, so I prefer to avoid being in contact with different people. And people, because we don't want to say something wrong, we try to avoid that. So another recommendation is, as Sandra mentioned, is ask questions. Sometimes we try to assume things, but my first advice is don't assume. Just ask questions when you are not sure about a culture of someone, when you are not sure about someone, ask the right question, and in a really polite way. But it has been an interesting journey. As I mentioned before, based on that, we created the toolkit, and the toolkit is fascinating. You will find like a lot of terminology and how to start the conversation, and actually recommendations for hiring managers. For example, how you can find like a diverse candidates, how you can run an interview, avoiding biases. And this is a really good point about unconscious bias, because sometimes people say that, oh, I am biased and that is something bad, but it's not something bad. We all have biases, and that is normal. But the problem is when we are taking decisions. So that is a really good point when we talk about diversity and inclusion. So, and also you will find information about where you can find, where you can validate the certificate of someone who has a diploma for a different country, and actually the type of visa as well, and where you can find diverse resources as well. So it is a really, really good document, and really, really key points and tools that you can use if you are in a hiring manager positions. This is just phase 1, but the center is creating phase 2 and phase 3, as Sandra mentioned before. And based on that, we created as well the Race Advisory Council. So you are more than welcome if you are interested. So you can go to the website of the center. There is a button where you can register, and we will be more than happy to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for the tools that can actually be used to help these issues. And we're really grateful for that. Thank you. I wanted to ask if any of the speakers have anything to add to what anyone had to say, or ask each other questions.
I think Pedro brought up a very important point regarding educational qualifications, because it's often something that's thrown out there saying, oh, maybe they just don't have like the educational qualifications for this and whatever. But our research shows that actually like non-Irish nationals are more likely to have a third level education than Irish nationals. Our recent work on the migrant integration actually found that most migrant groups have higher levels of third level qualification, but a lot of the problems comes with recognizing their qualifications, and it's quite difficult if you've come from another country and you have a third level degree, or you're a PhD and you're a doctor, and you come to Ireland and all of a sudden your qualifications aren't being recognized. So it's very important. And what he brought up about the employment permits, it's very important that employers are educated on how these permits work, and that it's not a big thing when they realize that they might have to, or they want to employ someone that has to work under a permit. It should be something that's taught to all employers, so it's something they don't even need to think about. They're completely aware of how this works, and it doesn't bode any kind of problems on hiring people.
And just to add to that, Shannon, and it is a really important point, because if you don't get through that sifting in the first instance, you're never even going to get to the interview. And it is certainly one of the things that we discovered from speaking to people, the barriers, what are the barriers of getting through that first sift? And the name obviously is one, but what the other piece then was around the translation of your skills. So it's one about the translation of your academic credentials, if that's what it is. But then the other challenge becomes, how do you describe your experience? So how can you describe that your experience of maybe where, your experience from Brazil or Africa or wherever else you've come from, how do you describe that in a way that's meaningful and equivalent? So when and the challenge can be, particularly with HR processes, is quite often the person that's doing the CV screening is not the person that, is in the department where the job is. So you have to be able to do that matching. And it's really important. That's an important piece of work that we find people are doing it in their spare time. I think there needs to be a more formal way for people to get access to that type of service when they, either when they come to Ireland or even if it's a case of, there's people who've made it into the workplace. That's what we're trying to do around that mentoring, that there's people who are already in the workplace who are happy then to work on a voluntary basis to help people with the translation of their CVs. And it's not the language translation, it's the translation of describing their skills and experience.
Thank you. So we have some questions from the audience. The first question is for Pedro. We often see a lot of glass ceiling for BAME folks in the workplace, with very few making it into management. What can be done to fix this by employers and employees?
Well, I think, first of all, it is very important to understand, to hear the whole voices of the company. I really believe that something that companies can do, the first thing is to create spaces, to identify what is the problem that we want to solve. Because we try to assume things, we try to guess of what we believe, but remember that we are biased. So I think that the most important thing, for my recommendation, is to create spaces where people have the opportunity to express what is the problem that they are facing. And based on that, we can really be very, very helpful. But definitely, we want to hear the whole voices of the company.
Thank you. The next question is for Shannon. Do you have any advice on how to be inclusive and diverse in our daily lives?
I guess it's just listening to people and not being afraid to have those conversations. As Sandra said, sometimes it's people get a bit closed off and they're kind of afraid to talk. But listening to people and understanding where people are coming from, and more important than that is making sure that whenever you're having any conversation with anyone, that you're not letting anyone say anything that's racist, that's sexist, that it shouldn't be said in your company, even if it's a joke. And I know as Irish people, we're all up for having the crack and whatever, but racist jokes and sexist jokes, they're not crack. They're not, and they make other people feel excluded, and that's not the kind of society that we want to live in. Because I think the easiest thing to remember is treat someone how you would like to be treated. And if someone was making those kinds of jokes about you or your family or where you're coming from, you would get upset. You wouldn't take, oh, it's just a laugh. That's not okay.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I would like to add something else. And sometimes we try to treat people as we want to be treated. So I think when we are very inclusive, we treat others as they want to be treated, not as we want. So I think if we see what they want and know what I want, the conversation will change. And that is, for me, in my opinion, that is the best way to be inclusive.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is for Sandra. Is diversity and inclusion a continuous process?
Yeah, I certainly believe it is, because I don't think it's ever done. And, you know, when I think about even diversity in teams, that, you know, all the research shows that within a diverse team, it takes longer to get the team to gel and to work together. But when you do, it's absolutely magic from an innovation perspective and from an ideas perspective and a collaborative perspective. And we see this, you know, and it's productivity times 10. But the challenge becomes, you know, the minute you add another new person into that team, all of a sudden everything has to shift again, because now things have to kind of settle down again and now readjust with the new person. And this is just the nature of humans, right? When you're working with people and you're working with humans, that's just the way it goes. So I would say the work of diversity and inclusion is never done. You know, when I think about diversity and inclusion, I think, you know, diversity is something that's organically, naturally happening, right? That's, you know, globalization, that's what's happening. But inclusion becomes the challenge then, you know, and in particularly in workplaces, how can we create welcoming environments for everybody and teams, in particular team environments that you know, are welcoming for people and help them connect into the mission of the organization. And every time somebody new comes in, you have to readjust that and kind of get things to kind of settle down and work again. So it's never done.
Thank you. Next question is for Pedro. What is the biggest benefit of diversity and inclusion you have seen in your workplace?
Wow, that is really an interesting question. I think Shannen mentioned the benefits a little bit, but basically we can solve more problems, you know, on having different perception, different point of view, you know, having like people from different nationality, different age, different sexual orientation. That is very beneficial. You can be more innovative as a company, and you can see how the productivity will increase as well. But as Sandra mentioned, it is very important to not only be diverse, we have to be inclusive, and we have to create the environment, we have to create the culture to make everyone feel included and belong.
Thank you. Next question is for Shannen. What can we do to make everyone feel included?
Oh gosh. There's a lot that you can do. Talking to people is one of the main things. Like when it comes to your daily life and being in your workplace, just as an employee, there's a lot you can do. Talking to people, including people. Like that's where inclusivity comes from. Whenever you're doing something, include people in your workplace. If someone new has started, if there's someone that you've seen that's a bit on the outside, you include them, you invite them to things, you get talking to people, and that's how you actually meet the most interesting people in your life. There's no downside to inclusivity. It's not something that we should just strive for in the workplace. It's something you should strive for in your genuine life. That's how you get the best experiences. Your life is boring if you meet people that are all like you. It's boring. No one wants to talk to themselves all day. Meet other people, and it's something we can do so much now in Ireland. We're blessed to be able to do because of how diverse Ireland has been becoming, and yeah, it's a tall order to answer, but
yeah, thank you for that point.
Okay, can I just, Elizabeth, sorry, do you mind if I just add something to that? Because, you know, the biggest challenge for us as humans is that we're pattern matching machines, right? And there's this concept in research, it's called homophily, and it's this people like themselves. That's how I describe it. So this is the challenge for all of us, no matter who we are. We like hanging out with, talking to, being around, whether it be socially or in work, people who are like us. And this is the problem, right? We hire people like us. We hang out with people who are like us. We have teams of people who are like us. So, and the reason we do that is because we're pattern matching machines, right? So we think we're great, so therefore people who are like us are going to be great as well, right? And we have to fight against that all the time. So to Shannon's point around that, it's around being curious and consciously making an effort to come outside that automatic thinking and the automatic behavior, and being brave in some instances. And sometimes it's not, sometimes it's just making an effort and stopping the automatic thinking of being curious about people who are different and having different conversations. And as Shannon said, it's a great point. You know, if it's nobody wants to be excluded, right? There's research that shows exclusion for humans is the equivalent of physical pain. So if you map what it's like in somebody's brain who's been excluded, it is exactly the same as if you kicked them, right? So we do not want to be excluded. And if you're a minority, whether that's because of your gender, your sexuality, your race, whatever it is, you're automatically going to feel excluded because you're in the minority, right? So if for all of us, one thing you can do is to be brave, stop the pattern matching, and go and have a conversation with somebody and be welcoming and be inclusive.
I think that speaks to the implicit bias that Pedro mentioned earlier. Like you said, learning how to unlearn that and deconstruct that and move forward. So we're going to take our last question, and that's for Sandra. How can we show the importance of inclusion and diversity to someone who can be judgmental?
How can we show? So that's a tough one, right? To judgmental, right? So I don't know, people who are judgmental, I don't even know how do you describe, how do you quantify somebody who's judgmental? Because if I think about somebody who's judgmental, you know, like if I hear somebody being judgmental, right, there's one thing I always think to myself, and I don't always say it out loud. I always say, I would not want to be them in their head. Because in my view, somebody who is judgmental outside, you can multiply that by 10 for what's going on in their head. Because if you're going to be the kind of person that you are judging somebody for whatever reason, how they look, how they speak, their choices, and whatever, you can be sure that that harshness of that voice is what controls your own life. So that's the first thing. Now, if I was asked about people who are ignorant, that's a different thing. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but there are some people who just think, what's the problem? There's no problem. Everything is okay for me. I'm cool. What's your, you know, and that's not okay. That's different. That's not judgmental. That's somebody just being ignorant and deciding that their world is the way it is. So I describe those people as the people in the fishbowl, right? Because they are the fishbowl of privilege, where the fishbowl of privilege is, you know, I describe it as you say to the fish, how's the water? And they go, what water? Because they don't even recognize it because they're in it. This is the privilege that they live in every day. And there's only one way, and it's not there is no one way that you get everybody, but there's only one way that I found that is effective with each individual that I speak to, and that's treat them with respect, number one, right? So if they're being disrespectful, it doesn't mean that you lower your standards, okay? So being respectful, try and get a sense of where they're coming from, and that can be very difficult if they're being rude or disrespectful. But the third piece I always try and do is find how I can connect with them. And you know, sometimes by telling stories or even stopping them and being vulnerable in some way by going, that's not okay. That's actually disrespectful what you've done there, or that, you know, that's hurtful what you've said, or, you know, interrupting again this pattern of you know, and that's a tough thing to do, but and you know, there isn't one way, not like there's no one way that catches all the people who judge, because everybody judges differently. There's no one way to catch all the people who want to remain ignorant of this and think D&I is not for them. It is one person at a time, and that's why I said earlier about the critical mass, right? You know, there's enough people, good people in this country, in the world, in your workplace, in your team. There is the critical mass of the good people who want things to be different.
Oh, I think there's a connection issue.
Yeah.
For somebody else.
Sorry, Sandra, we lost you there for a few seconds.
Just the last point I made was just, don't sit back and leave it for somebody else. Be part of the change. There's enough people in your organization that want things to be different. Like, who's going to be taking everybody on here this evening must be committed to this, because why would you be here on a Thursday evening? Why? So there's enough people here that want this world to be different. So be part of that change.
Thank you so much. We're coming up to our last few minutes. I just wanted to ask if we have any final comments to make or anything else to add before we close off for the evening.
I think Sandra covered some very, very important points. I think one of the things that all of us can do is to be aware that we all have biases. We all do. If you're someone who says you have no bias, you're just not recognizing what it is. You need to know that you have bias. Everyone does. We have it. It's the most important thing is educating yourself, being aware that you have it. And just because you have a bias doesn't mean that you need to automatically beat yourself up and think that you're a terrible person. If you recognize that bias and keep doing it, that's not good. But if you recognize that you have a bias, the most important thing you can do is to work to change that. So anytime you catch yourself having a thought where you're making a prejudgment on someone else, the most important thing is to ask yourself why do you believe that? Because normally it's some kind of bias that you have in your head, especially when we make split-second decisions about other people based on how they look or how they sound. That's a bias that you have. That's part of being socialized. It's part of growing up in a society. This isn't something that you put in your head yourself. Other people put it there. People aren't, like everyone says, that people aren't born racist. No child comes out and is instantly racist. It's not something that happens. This is something that happens in society. It's not your fault that you got this way, but it's your obligation to change it. And all you need to do is just be curious, recognize when you're being biased, and look into ways on how to change that.
Yeah, I love that point about we all have biases, that we just need to recognize it and try and catch ourselves upon it and change it. That it's not our fault, we're all products of our environment, so it's our responsibility now to try and change that. Do we have anything else to add?
Well, I would say from my end, like, to recognize that there is a problem that we have to solve. I think that is the first point. And the second one is, like, identify, a situation where you have felt excluded, because that, I think when we are a little bit like, I don't understand about diversity. And I am saying that because when I started to work with Sandra, she asked me, can you think in any situation where you have felt excluded? And when she asked that question, I started to understand what diversity and inclusion was.
Thank you so much for that, Pedro. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. I want to thank you to our lovely speakers for their insights. I think there's a lot of takeaways from tonight. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. This video will also be posted on our YouTube channel, so you have the opportunity to share also. Have an amazing evening and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.